It is no exaggeration to say that personality theory has been influenced more by Sigmund Freud than by anyone else. His system of psychoanalysis was the first formal theory of personality and is still the best known. Not only did Freud's work affect thinking about personality in psychology and psychiatry, but it also made a tremendous impact on the way we look at human nature in general. Few ideas in the history of civilization have had such a broad and profound influence. When he died in 1939, the New York Times noted his passing in an editorial, stating that Freud was the most effective disturber of complacency in our time. What made this theory interesting is its reliance on understanding personality as being driven by sex and aggression. These two forces arising from the id are seen as providing all the mental energy needed to propel personality development. Freud also had a dedicated group of followers who found him brilliant and adored his ideas. He also had some ardent critics. Freud had a command of language that made reading about his ideas interesting and fascinating. He also won the Goethe Prize in Literature. As a very brief biography, Freud was born in 1856. He was the eldest son of 8, which means he was the firstborn. And there is data that shows that firstborn children share certain traits, such as being natural leaders, wanting things their way, being energetic, logical, ambitious, and scholarly. Freud studied medicine because he was curious about human nature. He preferred teaching and doing research in physiology. He got a grant from the University of Vienna and studied hysteria with Charcot, a French neurologist, and learned hypnosis as a way to treat hysteria, which is characterized by paralysis or a body part not working right, such as not being able to move your arm. Hysteria is now called a conversion disorder. These look like physical disabilities, but they have no physiological cause. Continuing with Freud's biography, Joseph Breuer taught Freud about catharsis. Catharsis is the process of removing hysterical symptoms by talking them out. This soon replaced hypnosis as a technique. This led to talk therapy and eventually free association to bring the unconscious to the conscious mind. Freud had a midlife crisis in the 1890s, which eventually led him to abandon his seduction theory, which said a repressed memory of early childhood sexual abuse or molestation was responsible for mental health problems. He replaced it with the Oedipus complex. His greatest work or book is considered to be The Interpretation of Dreams in 1900. After 1900, he developed an international circle of followers, which included Alfred Adler, Carl Jung, and others. He was driven out of Austria by the Nazis in 1938 and died in London in 1939. Freud had an interesting personality. He's been described as a sensitive, passionate person. Unfortunately, many of his relationships didn't end well. Freud felt misunderstood and persecuted by his former friends. Even though he seemed to be constantly thinking of sex, he wasn't very sexually active. He did not like Americans because he believed we would try to make psychoanalysis trivial and popular, and I believe he was prophetic about that. Even though Freud's theories were pessimistic and took a dim view of human nature, psychoanalysis became very popular, and it is the most famous psychological theory. Even though his theory, especially as it relates to the id, seems all negative, Freud would argue that the id is not all negative. It is about survival and seeking pleasure. Contemporary psychology sees optimism as a cognitive or mental characteristic. And I think Freud would agree with this. In his book, The Future of an Illusion, in 1928, he said optimism is an illusion. Freud thought along the lines of Nietzsche, who argued optimism prolongs human suffering, so it is better to face the hard facts of reality. Freud said optimism comes with a cost, the denial of our instinctual nature, and hence the denial of reality. Freud did suggest that optimism is a part of human nature, but only a result of conflicts between the id and the superego. In his writings, Freud talked about the illusion of optimism and equated religious optimism and delusion. He said many were best left with their religious beliefs, or neuroses, as he called it, intact, and the belief that God was a benevolent Father who would shepherd them through life and beyond. This idea that the accurate perception of reality is equal to good mental health influenced psychology from then on. Reality testing became a hallmark of therapy, and psychotherapists said their job was to expose people to reality, however painful that might be. Freud's biggest idea in helping us understand personality involved the levels of mental life. He said there are two levels, the unconscious and the conscious. The unconscious has two sublevels, the preconscious and the unconscious proper. The unconscious contains the drives and urges that are beyond our awareness but motivate us nonetheless. They are beyond awareness, kind of like the stars in the sky during the day. We can't see them, but they're still there nonetheless. There are two sources of unconscious processes, repression and phylogenic endowment. Repression is the forcing of threatening or painful thoughts or feelings into the unconscious. Phylogenic endowment refers to the part of our unconscious that comes from ancestral experiences that were passed on to us. They are our genetic, inherited dispositions. The unconscious may appear in our consciousness, but in a distorted form, like a slip of the tongue or a symbolic image in a dream. The preconscious is just below the surface of conscious awareness. These are ideas at this level that come to conscious perception for only brief moments, such as through subliminal advertising. This is the place where all our memories, perceptions, and thoughts, which we are not consciously aware of at the time, are stored. Consciousness really plays a small role in psychoanalytic theory. It is defined as the mental elements in awareness at any given point in time. Freud came up with an iceberg metaphor to help us understand the three levels of mental life. First is the conscious. These are the thoughts and impulses that you are aware of. Next is the preconscious, which lies just below the surface. For example, in the unlikely event that your mind strays away from this lecture and you begin to think about what you did last night, you would be summoning up material from your preconscious into your conscious. Finally is the unconscious. Its deep, dark depths are the home of the instincts. The unconscious, that larger, invisible portion below the surface, is the focus of psychoanalytic theory. Freud divided the mind into three theoretical provinces, the id, the ego, and the superego. The direct German translations are the it, the I, and the above I. The id, the ego, and the superego stand for an instinctual drive, a realistic intelligence, and a social inner moral sense. The id is the center of primary primitive drives. Your id is what steers you toward that car on the showroom you know you can't afford, or your eyes toward that person across the room, even if you're there with your significant other. The id operates under the pleasure principle, meaning it has no regard for reality, constraints, or consequences. A wild sexual fantasy or dream is pure id. Freud visualized the id as a seething cauldron of the unconscious. The ego balances the drives of the id against the reality of the world. It follows the reality principle. More organized than the id, the ego attempts to avoid displeasure and pain. Individuals with good control of their impulses and the ability to tolerate difficult emotional challenges are said to have good ego strength. This is where Freud felt the real action was. Freud described the ego as critically involved in self-preservation of the organism through memory, awareness of stimuli, and making changes in the external environment to gain advantage. The ego can also delay or discharge various impulses of the id, leading to release of tension. The superego is the center of the internalized moral values, prohibitions, and ideals of the person. The superego is what compels men to climb out of foxholes under fire to pull a wounded comrade back to safety. It is also what probably drove you to select a major in a subject that involves helping others. It contains your ego ideal, your idealized self, the self you want yourself ideally to be. The superego is also where your conscience lives and is responsible for the experience of guilt. I like to use the example of a traffic cop to illustrate how the ego manages the id and the superego. The ego is the cop who directs the impulses and drives. The ego decides what to allow through. It stops the id's impulses and lets the higher moral thinking of the superego through. Let's say I'm at a coffee shop and a very attractive woman sits near me. The id tells me to move to sit next to the woman and put some moves on her. The ego says stop. The superego says I can't do this because I'm already in a committed relationship and it wouldn't be right. The ego is concerned because the id is impulsive, unconcerned with social mores, and wants only pleasure. The ego, as a traffic cop, waves the superego's desires through. So I simply smile at the woman and continue to work on my computer. The ego has to reduce the conflict between the demands of the id and the demands of the superego. According to Freud, this conflict is ever present because the instincts are always pressing for satisfaction, while the taboos of society are always working to limit such satisfaction. Freud believed that the defenses must, to some extent, always be in operation. Although defense mechanisms vary in their specifics, they have two characteristics in common. They are all denials or distortions of reality, and they all operate unconsciously. We are unaware of them. I'm going to cover just a few of the defense mechanisms, and I urge you to study carefully this part of the chapter in the text. Repression is the most fundamental and most frequently used defense mechanism. It is an involuntary removal of something from conscious awareness. It is an unconscious type of forgetting of the existence of something that brings us discomfort or pain. Repression can operate on memories of situations or people, on our perceptions of the present, so that we may fail to see some obviously disturbing event right in front of our eyes, and even on the body's physiological functioning. A man can so strongly repress the sex drive that he becomes impotent. The defense mechanism of denial is related to depression and involves denying the existence of some external threat or traumatic event that has occurred. Let's say some person with a terminal illness may deny the imminence of death, or parents of a child who has died may continue to deny the loss by keeping the child's room unchanged. In reaction formation, we defend ourselves against a disturbing impulse by actively expressing the opposite impulse. For example, a person who feels threatened by sexual longings may become a rabid crusader against pornography. Another way of defending against disturbing impulses is to project them onto someone else. This defense mechanism is called projection. Lustful, aggressive, and other unacceptable impulses are seen as being possessed by other people, not by oneself. The person says, in effect, I don't hate him, he hates me. In regression, the person retreats or regresses to an earlier period of life that was more pleasant and free from the current level of frustration and anxiety. Regression usually involves a return to one of the stages of childhood development. Rationalization is a defense mechanism that involves reinterpreting our behavior to make it seem more rational and therefore more acceptable. We excuse or justify a threatening thought or action by persuading ourselves that there is a rational explanation for it. A person who is fired from a job may rationalize by saying that they really didn't like the job anyway. If an object that satisfies an id impulse is not available, the person may shift the impulse to another object. This is known as displacement. For example, children who hate their parents or adults who hate their bosses but are afraid to express their hostility for fear of being punished may displace the aggression onto someone else, usually someone who is less likely to fight back or retaliate. Now, whereas displacement involves finding a substitute object to satisfy id impulses, sublimation involves altering the id impulses themselves. The instinctual energy is thus diverted into other channels of expression. ones that society considers acceptable and admirable. Sexual energy, for example, can be diverted or sublimated into artistically creative behaviors. Freud believed that all behaviors are defensive, but that not everyone uses the same defenses in the same way. All of us are driven by the same id impulses, but there is not the same universality in the nature of the ego and superego. Although these structures of the personality perform the same functions for everyone, their content varies from one person to another. They differ because they are formed through experience, and no two people have precisely the same experiences. Thus, part of our personality is formed on the basis of the unique relationships we have as children with various people and objects. We develop a personal set of character attributes, a consistent pattern of behavior that defines each of us as an individual. Freud identified stages of psychosexual development which focused on childhood and puberty. The infantile period, from birth to around age 5, is the most important in terms of forming one's personality. Within the infantile period, there are 3 phases: the oral, anal, and phallic phases. These phases coincide with the development of the 3 primary erotic zones: the mouth, the genitals, and the anus. These phases are temporal in order and can overlap and continue into later life. The psychosexual stages of development was a controversial idea, that infants and children have a sexual life. Childhood sexuality is different, as it is not about reproduction, but about self-pleasure. It is autoerotic. Infants start out by satisfying their oral needs, because the mouth is the first part of the body to provide pleasure. You don't have to be around babies much to see how busy they are with their mouths. The main conflict during this period is weaning, withdrawing from the breast or bottle. Sometimes a child has an uncomfortable, painful, or even a traumatic experience during the weaning process, resulting in being fixated at the oral stage. So there could be problems with overeating or smoking later in life, or problems with nail biting, pencil chewing, or thumb sucking. Psychologically, being fixated at the oral level or oral stage may result in being overly dependent. The person may want to be babied, nurtured, and have others make decisions for them. The second phase is the anal phase. The child obtains pleasure from first expelling feces, then during toilet training from retaining feces. Many conflicts arise around toilet training and issues of self-control. Adults who are compulsive, overly neat, rigid, and never messy are fixated or stuck at the anal stage, according to psychoanalysts. The phallic phase is when the child discovers that he has, or she discovers that she does not have, a penis. There is an awakening as sexual desire becomes directed outward, and according to Freud, it is directed toward the parent of the opposite sex. The male and female Oedipus complexes develop. Little boys fall in love with their mothers. Little girls fall in love with their fathers. For the boy, he sees his father as a competitor. The complex involves the unconscious wish to have his mother all to himself by eliminating the father. This complex also involves the fear that the father will castrate him. This castration anxiety eventually results in the boy giving up his sexual desire for mommy. For the girl, the situation is a little different. The little girl blames her mother for not having a penis. She desires her father, yet also envies him for his penis. This is called penis envy. Penis envy is a little different for girls than castration anxiety is for boys. The girl does not fear the mother like the boy fears the father. Freud said the girl becomes embarrassed by the inadequacy of her genitalia, leading to giving up the pleasure of masturbation. The storms and stresses of the oral, anal, and phallic stages of psychosexual development form the basic material out of which most of the adult personality is shaped. The 3 major structures, the id, ego, and superego, have been formed by around age 5, and the relationships among them are being solidified. Fortunately, because the child and parents certainly could use some rest, the next 5 or 6 years are quiet. The latency period is technically not a psychosexual stage of development. very little development occurs, as this is a time when the child goes to school and learns skills needed to become an adult in society. The genital period from puberty to adulthood involves another sexual awakening. If the Oedipus complex has been resolved, this stage begins in puberty and lasts through adulthood. Sexual energy is directed outward toward another person, as reproduction is now possible. During this stage, the vagina finally obtains the status that the penis had in infancy. Freud felt that maturity, where people have successfully completed earlier developmental stages, seldom happens because there are too many opportunities for psychic conflict. Freud identified two categories of instincts which drive personality development from the id: life instincts and death instincts. The life instincts serve the purpose of survival, and they're oriented toward growth and development. The psychic energy manifested by the life instincts is the libido. The life instinct Freud considered most important for the personality is sex, which he defined in rather broad terms. He was not referring just to the erotic, but also included almost all pleasurable behaviors and thoughts. In opposition to the life instincts, Freud postulated the destructive or death instincts. He stated the obvious fact that all living things eventually decay and die, returning to their original inanimate state. And he believed that people have an unconscious wish to die. One component of the death instinct is the aggressive drive, which he saw as the wish to die turned against objects other than the self. The aggressive drive compels us to destroy, conquer, and kill. And Freud eventually came to consider aggression as compelling a part of human nature as sex. You already have a general idea of what the word anxiety means because you know how you feel when you're anxious about something. Anxiety is not unlike fear, but we may not know what we're afraid of. Freud described anxiety as an objectless fear, meaning that we cannot point to its source. Freud identified three types of anxiety that emerge from the ego, produced by interactions between the id, ego, superego, and the outside world. Neurotic anxiety results from conflict between the id and the ego. This neurotic anxiety is an unconscious fear of being punished for impulsively displaying id-dominated behavior. This is anxiety about an unknown danger. An example is someone who feels anxiety because she is unconsciously attracted to another person. Moral anxiety comes from conflict between the superego and the ego. People who have low self-esteem or feel worthless or ashamed most of the time may have moral anxiety, as an overly powerful superego constantly challenges them to live up to higher standards. Realistic anxiety involves a fear of real dangers in the real world. Most of us justifiably fear fires, hurricanes, earthquakes, and similar disasters, and we run from wild animals, jump out of the paths of speeding cars, and run out of burning buildings. This is a response to a real external threat. For example, being confronted by a large, aggressive man with a knife. The ego is threatened by a real external factor. Some applications of psychoanalytic theory are free association, dream analysis, and projective tests. Free association is straightforward. The therapist simply says a word, such as boat, or moon, or cat, and the client says the first word that pops in his or her mind. Now, Freud believed there was nothing random about the information answered or uncovered during free association, and that it was not subject to a person's conscious choice. The material revealed in free association was predetermined, forced upon them by the nature of their conflict. Freud also found that sometimes the technique did not operate so freely. Some experiences or memories were evidently too painful to talk about, and the client would be reluctant to disclose them. Freud called these moments resistances. Freud believed that dreams represent, in symbolic form, repressed desires, fears, and conflicts. So strongly have these feelings been repressed that they can surface only in disguised fashion during sleep. And he argued that there were two aspects of dreams: the manifest content, which refers to the actual events in the dreams, and the latent content, which is the hidden symbolic meaning of the dream. Projective tests are sometimes used to uncover unconscious conflicts in unconscious material, such as through ink blots or ambiguous pictures, which clients are asked to describe. Here's an example of an ink blot from the Rorschach test. What do you see? Projective tests attempt to probe that invisible portion of our personality. The theory underlying projective techniques is that when we're presented with an ambiguous stimulus, like this ink blot, or a picture that can be interpreted in more than one way, we will project our innermost needs, fears, and values onto the stimulus when we're asked to describe it. Now, because the interpretation of the results of projective tests is so subjective, these tests are not high in reliability or validity. In critiquing psychoanalytic theory, a frequent criticism of Freud is that he did not understand women, and that his theory of personality is mostly a theory oriented toward men. There's a large measure of truth to this criticism, and Freud acknowledged that he lacked a complete understanding of the female psyche. Near the end of his life, he was still asking, what does woman want? Why didn't Freud know what women wanted? Well, one answer is that he was a product of his times, and society during those times was dominated by men. In 19th century Austria, women were second-class citizens with few rights and privileges, and they had little opportunity to enter a profession. Freud's theories were viewed as difficult to test, as there were criticisms about his scientific method. Freud's research method was the case study, which does not rely on objective observation. It is not controlled and systematic, nor is it amenable to duplication and verification. Nevertheless, psychoanalytic theory generated considerable research. It is difficult to falsify. Some Freudian concepts have been supported by empirical research. The unconscious, repression, projection, displacement, verbal slips, and some characteristics of oral and anal personality types. But major portions of Freud's theory have not been scientifically validated. In addition, it is not a good guide to solving practical problems, and on the positive side, it is an internally consistent theory. Freud did not present us with a flattering or optimistic image of human nature. Quite the opposite. He argued that each person is a dark cellar of conflict in which a battle is continually raging. Human beings are depicted in gloomy, pessimistic terms, condemned to a struggle with our inner forces, which we are almost always destined to lose. Doomed to anxiety, to the thwarting of at least some of our driving impulses, we experience continuing tension and conflict. We are endlessly defending ourselves against the forces of the id, which stand ever alert to topple us. Not a very happy prospect. Freud's overall picture of human nature reflects his own personal view of humanity, which darkened with age and declining health. His judgment of people in general was harsh, and we can see this stern judgment of us in his personality theory.